A police officer thought he could intimidate an old man sitting alone in the park. He wanted to show his power, to make an example out of him. But in just a few seconds, he would realize he had made the biggest mistake of his life, because the man he had just tried to control was Chuck Norris. Subscribe to the channel, share the video, and write in the comments what city you were from. It was a warm afternoon at Riverside Park. The golden light of the sun filtered through the towering oak and sycamore trees, casting soft shadows on the pavement. The air carried the scent of freshly cut grass, and a gentle breeze rustled the leaves, offering brief relief from the lingering heat. Everywhere you looked, people were enjoying the peaceful afternoon. Joggers moved with steady determination, their sneakers tapping rhythmically against the pavement. A group of teenagers sat near a picnic table, their laughter mixing with the chirping of birds. An elderly couple strolled hand in hand, their steps slow, savoring the moment. The park was alive. Yet in one small corner, away from the crowd, a single man sat alone. He wasn't exercising. He wasn't talking to anyone. He simply sat unmoving, feeding the pigeons, tossing small handfuls of seeds onto the ground, watching as the birds eagerly pecked at them. He moved with precision, each action slow, deliberate, controlled. His clothes were simple: a black flannel shirt, slightly worn jeans, and a brown leather hat that had long lost its shine. His belt buckle, scratched and faded, hinted at a man who had seen more than most. His beard, neatly trimmed but showing the full marks of age, framed a face carved by time and experience. He was a man at peace, a man who had nothing to prove, a man who simply existed in the moment. And while most people in the park paid him no mind, one man noticed him. One man saw his stillness and mistook it for weakness. What happened next would change everything. The sound of heavy boots echoed against the pavement as Officer Jack Reynolds patrolled the park. His uniform was pristine, his mirrored sunglasses reflecting the world around him. His utility belt was stocked with everything he needed: baton, taser, firearm, all polished and ready. Reynolds wasn't a man known for patience or kindness. He didn't serve to protect. He served to control. As he scanned the park, his gaze locked onto a lone figure sitting on a bench, completely still. An old man, dressed simply in a black flannel shirt, worn jeans, and a brown leather hat, feeding pigeons without a care in the world. Something about him felt off to Reynolds. Too calm, too relaxed. He wasn't jogging. He wasn't watching over a child. He was just sitting there. And to Reynolds, that meant one thing: defiance. Without hesitation, the officer veered off the main path and started toward the bench. His boots hit the ground with purpose, his fingers instinctively flexing near his baton. A few passers-by noticed, their gazes flicking between the officer and the old man. A woman walking her dog slowed down. A group of teenagers near a picnic table exchanged quiet glances. They had seen Reynolds at work before. They knew what happened when someone didn't comply fast enough. As Reynolds stopped in front of the bench, his shadow fell over the seated man. He stood tall, feet planted wide, hands resting on his belt, radiating the authority he had come to expect people to recognize. But the man in front of him did not move. He did not acknowledge his presence. He simply continued scattering birdseed onto the ground, as if Reynolds wasn't even there. A flicker of irritation crossed the officer's mind. He was used to obedience, used to people reacting to his presence. But this old man sat as if the badge on Reynolds' chest meant nothing. The air around them grew heavier, charged with unspoken tension. Reynolds cleared his throat, his voice sharp and commanding. But the old man still did not respond. And in that moment, something shifted. For the first time in a long time, Officer Jack Reynolds felt something he wasn't used to. Not hesitation, not doubt, but something close. And he didn't like it. The silence between them stretched longer than it should have. Officer Jack Reynolds stood tall, his shadow cast over the seated man, his presence demanding acknowledgement. But Chuck Norris remained still, dropping another handful of birdseed onto the ground as the pigeons fluttered and pecked around his boots. Reynolds' jaw tightened. This wasn't how things worked. People moved when he told them to. They responded when he spoke. Yet, here sat an old man, completely unbothered, as if the officer didn't even exist. The officer exhaled through his nose, a sharp breath of irritation. His fingers curled at his sides. He cleared his throat loudly, ensuring his voice cut through the air with authority. "You can't sit here all day," he said, his tone edged with impatience. "Nothing?" Reynolds took a step closer, the polished tip of his boot stopping just inches from Chuck's foot. "I said, you can't sit here all day." Still no response. No shift in posture. No flicker of acknowledgement. The tension in the air grew heavier, pressing against the space between them. Nearby, a woman with a stroller slowed, her gaze flicking between the officer and the old man. A group of young men at a picnic table exchanged glances, sensing the escalation. Reynolds flexed his fingers, feeling the reassuring presence of his baton at his side. He had no patience for defiance, especially not from some old man who thought he could ignore the law. His voice dropped, sharper this time. "I'm talking to you." Chuck Norris' hand moved, but only to toss another handful of birdseed onto the pavement. The birds didn't scatter. The wind rustled through the trees. Everything else in the park continued as before, but between them, the weight of the moment had shifted. Reynolds clenched his jaw. This wasn't hesitation. This wasn't defiance. It was something else entirely, something deeper. The old man wasn't ignoring him out of arrogance. It was as if Reynolds simply wasn't worth acknowledging. A flicker of something unfamiliar passed through the officer's mind. It wasn't anger. It wasn't frustration. It was something close to unease. He buried it. His patience was gone. With one smooth motion, he reached for his baton, gripping it tightly as he took another step forward. The final warning. The unspoken threat. This wouldn't take long. A firm strike against the bench, a show of force, and the old man would understand. He raised the baton, and in an instant, before he could even register what was happening, Chuck Norris' hand moved. It wasn't fast. It wasn't aggressive. It was simply precise. Reynolds felt it before he saw it. A sudden, controlled pressure around his wrist. Not painful, not violent, just absolute. His breath hitched. He had been stopped. His arm, which had been mid-swing, was now frozen in place, held in an iron grip. The baton didn't land. It didn't even finish its descent. It just stopped. The officer's pulse quickened. His instinct told him to pull back, to resist, to break free. But he couldn't. The hold wasn't brutal. It was effortless. As if Chuck Norris wasn't exerting strength, just applying the exact amount of force necessary to send a message. And that message was clear. Reynolds tried to react, but the grip tightened just slightly. Not enough to hurt. Just enough to remind him that he was no longer in control. For the first time in his career, Officer Jack Reynolds felt something unfamiliar creep into his chest. A quiet, undeniable realization. He had just made a mistake. Officer Jack Reynolds barely had time to process what had just happened. His wrist was caught in an unshakable grip, his baton suspended midair, completely useless. It wasn't pain that held him in place. It was control. A level of control so precise, so effortless, that it sent a chill through his spine. For the first time in years, he was the one restrained. His breath came quicker now, his mind struggling to grasp the situation. He had trained for physical altercations. He had subdued criminals, restrained suspects, broken up fights. But this wasn't a fight. This was something else entirely. Chuck Norris hadn't moved from his spot. He was still seated, still calm, still feeding the pigeons. The only difference now was that his hand was wrapped around Reynolds' wrist, keeping him locked in place as if it were the easiest thing in the world. The crowd around them had started to take notice. Murmurs spread among the park-goers. A man near a bench leaned forward, whispering to his friend. A woman in workout gear stopped stretching, eyes fixed on the scene unfolding before her. A teenage boy nudged his friend. their hushed voices carrying disbelief. Reynolds' pride flared. He needed to act fast. He wrenched his arm back, trying to break free, but the grip tightened just slightly, effortlessly nullifying his movement. It was a subtle adjustment, but it spoke volumes. Chuck Norris wasn't just stopping him. He was controlling him. A fresh wave of anger burned in Reynolds' chest. No old man, no matter how strong, was going to humiliate him in public. His grip on the baton tightened, and with his free hand, he reached for his firearm. But before his fingers could even touch the holster, the pressure on his wrist shifted. A sudden twist, not forceful, not violent, just precise enough to make his body instinctively comply. Reynolds felt his balance shift. His knee buckled. And then, just like that, the baton slipped from his grasp and clattered onto the pavement. The sound echoed louder than it should have. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder. A gasp came from somewhere behind him. People were watching now. Not just casually glancing, but truly watching. Reynolds stumbled back a step, his mind racing. The weight of the situation was pressing down on him now, more suffocating than ever. He had just lost his weapon. No! He had it taken from him. Chuck Norris still hadn't stood up. He hadn't fought back. He hadn't retaliated. He had simply removed the officer's ability to attack. Reynolds' face flushed hot with a mix of humiliation and frustration. His fingers twitched. His body screamed for him to regain control, to do something before it was too late. His hand shot toward his gun, his last remaining tool of authority. But before he even realized it, it was gone too. The shift was so fast, so fluid, that he didn't even feel it leave his holster. But now, there it was. Chuck Norris held the officer's gun in his own hand, examining it casually, as if it were nothing more than an object of passing curiosity. The crowd let out a collective gasp. Someone whispered, "No way." Reynolds' stomach dropped. Chuck Norris didn't aim the weapon. He didn't point it at the officer. He simply held it for a moment, then, just as effortlessly as before, he let it drop to the ground. The pistol landed on the pavement with a dull thud, lying next to the fallen baton. Another moment of silence. The crowd was no longer whispering. They were staring. Reynolds took a shaky step backward, his body rigid, his breath uneven. In a matter of seconds, he had gone from being the one in control to being completely powerless. He had no baton, no gun, no authority, and Chuck Norris still hadn't moved from the bench. For the first time in his career, Officer Jack Reynolds felt something he never had before. Not anger, not frustration, not even humiliation. The silence in the park was deafening. The world seemed to slow every breath, every movement hanging in the charged air. Officer Jack Reynolds stood frozen, his body rigid, his mind spiraling as the reality of the situation set in. His baton lay on the ground. His gun, his last symbol of power, had just been taken and discarded like an afterthought. He had lost control. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder. People were no longer just curious onlookers. They were witnesses to something they couldn't quite believe. Some pulled out their phones, their cameras capturing every humiliating second. Others simply stared, stunned into silence. Reynolds clenched his fists at his sides. His breath came in sharp, shallow bursts. Every instinct in his body screamed at him to do something, to reclaim his authority, to take back control. But Chuck Norris still hadn't moved. He still sat there, as calm as ever, his hands now resting on his lap. His posture had not changed. His breathing had not quickened. It was as if nothing had happened, as if disarming a trained officer had required no more effort than flicking dust from his sleeve. And that was what made it worse. Reynolds wasn't just defeated. He was dismissed. He could feel it. The shift in the air, the quiet understanding spreading through the watching crowd. This was no longer a police officer exercising authority over a civilian. This was a man who had overstepped and had just been put back in his place. But his pride wouldn't let him accept it. His jaw clenched, his fingers twitching at his sides, his muscles tense, his body aching to act, to strike, to win. He had spent years training for physical altercations. He had overpowered countless men before. He had never been made to feel this powerless. And yet, he didn't dare make another move, because deep down, something inside him knew. If he tried, it would only get worse. His body screamed at him to attack. His mind warned him not to. But pride is a dangerous thing. Without fully realizing it, his body moved before his mind could stop him. He lunged. A final, desperate attempt to reclaim what had been taken from him. A last effort to show that he was still in control. But Chuck Norris had already seen it coming. Before Reynolds even had a chance to complete his motion, he felt it again. That same impossibly smooth, effortless shift in control. His wrist caught. His balance gone. His weight redirected. His entire world tilted as he was suddenly airborne. For the briefest of moments, he was weightless. Then impact. Reynolds hit the ground hard, the force of it knocking the breath from his lungs. His back slammed against the pavement, the sky above him spinning. His hat tumbled off his head, landing a few feet away. The hard asphalt pressed against his spine, the rough texture biting into his palms as he braced himself in shock. He hadn't even seen it happen. 1 second. He was lunging. The next, he was on his back, staring up at the sky. It hadn't been violent. It hadn't been aggressive. There was no excessive force. Just efficiency. The kind of precision that only someone with absolute control could execute. And now, he was completely exposed. The whispers in the crowd turned into full conversations. Someone laughed. Another voice muttered, "Did you see that?" A man near the sidewalk shook his head in disbelief. Panic set in. He reached instinctively for his holster, but it was empty. His gun was in the hands of the man he had just tried to attack. But Chuck Norris didn't aim it, didn't threaten. He simply held it, and then let it drop to the ground. The people around them had seen it all. The officer, once feared, now stood powerless before an old man who had never once raised his voice. And then backup arrived. The commanding officer's eyes locked onto the old man, and his entire demeanor changed. He knew exactly who this was. The whispers spread. The realization dawned. The senior officer gave the order. The badge. The gun. Turn them in. And with that, everything Reynolds had built his career on was gone. He had lost without a single punch being thrown. And just like that, the officer learned the hardest lesson of his life. True strength isn't about force. It's about control. And some men were never meant to be challenged.